broad trends in travel? Because we've been hearing conflicting things from cruise lines, for example, versus airlines.
Yeah, listen, from our perspective, it seems broadly healthy, both on the global scale and particularly here in the United States. A recent study by brand Expedia said that about 85% of Americans are planning to take a trip between now and September. And so people are traveling, looks broadly healthy to us.
What effect, if anything, is currency having at scale?
Well, listen, currency generally, for us, generally sees shifts in travel patterns. So, in periods like this where you see a U.S. dollar being particularly strong, you see more international travel by Americans going to places like Europe, like Latin America. We do see those types of trends. But generally speaking, again, it's just a shift in travel patterns for a global player like ourselves.
In terms of acquisitions, is there and fueling growth? Is that picture going to change in the year to come?
Well, I don't know about the year to come. Acquisitions have always been a part of our playbook. I think if we look forward the next 5 years versus the last 5 years, there's probably a little bit less acquisition activity, but we will be opportunistic. And one of the things we did say on our last earnings call is, as we look out in the next couple of years, we see the opportunity to really generate strong free cash flow. And in fact, probably better free cash flow characteristics than we've seen over the last 5. And we will have an incremental bias towards repurchasing our own stock going forward when compared with the last 5 years.
It looks like the VRBO gross bookings did slow, though, Mark, to 2% from 5% the previous quarter. What's going on with the business there, as I know you've made a big name change, and that's been a big focus of trying to drive growth?
Yeah, so the gross bookings did slow down a little bit, just optically, largely. If you look at the first quarter versus the second quarter, you adjust for things like Easter, it's broadly a similar trend. And what we're seeing is continued healthy growth at the main VRBO brand. This is something we rebranded from VRBO. This was the thing that used to be the Noun. People would rent a VRBO for the weekend before there were any other competitors. That's the brand that we are putting our weight behind in the U.S. And over the course of the next couple of years, we are going to be rolling it out internationally. In the meantime, we are transitioning some of the other regional brands over to the VRBO platform, rebranding some of those sites VRBO, and that has put some headwinds on the business. That's something that will probably persist throughout the rest of this year, and then by 2020, we should be back into some more normalized growth rates. But listen, we're super optimistic about alternative accommodations generally for VRBO, but also for Expedia Group. We've got this inventory now on Expedia and Hotels.com. That's going to unlock more opportunities for us in the urban market here in the U.S. and also in all markets internationally.
We just talked to Larry Kudlow a moment ago about USTR and possible responses to this France digital services tax. Is that material for you?
Well, it is something we called out as a factor that could impact our Q3 earnings if it is passed into law. Listen, I think these digital services taxes are something that should be a concern. I think at the end of the day, the big digital platforms, the Amazons, the Googles of the world, maybe you could put us in that bucket. These have really put a lot of economic power in the hands of consumers in the way of reducing costs, making prices transparent. And the second that you start taxing these platforms and start putting friction in the system, ultimately the concern of that ends up landing right in the hands of consumers, and we don't think that's a good thing.
Well, that goes back to sort of the longstanding theory that the Europeans are using American innovation and American tech to subsidize their own economic shortcomings. Is that fair?
Well, I don't know about economic shortcomings. I think it's natural for nations to try to generate revenue. So, that's what they do to provide the services that they provide. I think what I can say is that there is a bed of innovation here in America. It is something that is fueling global growth. Most American players like ourselves have big footprints in Europe and around the world. We're also driving a huge amount of job growth into those economies as well. And so I think regulators around the world should just be, just mindful of the consequences of putting some of these taxation schemes in place around what other economic knock-on impacts that they could ultimately have.
Speaking of Europe and the UK, are you seeing any pickup there, or is it more or less more of the same, specifically also in the UK in terms of the continued concern about Brexit?
Well, so we did see a pretty significant impact around the March timeframe when the Brexit issue was at, really its hottest. When the date got pushed out to the end of October, we saw things bounce back a little bit. They're not quite at the levels we would expect to see. With respect to the rest of Europe, Q2 things looked pretty darn healthy to us across the board. France was a highlight. Spain looked pretty strong to us. I think in these summer months, this is peak summer season. So far, so good. Obviously, you look at the news, and you've got some heat waves. I think historically, if you look back at last year, the heat waves were a factor for travel patterns in Europe. So that's something I would keep our eye on.
Yeah, it's been really hot.
Record heat. Wilfred was
It's pretty
complaining
hot there,
about it
too.
yesterday in the UK, which
Yeah.
they don't apparently handle well. So, Mark, bottom line is double-digit room night growth sustainable in this environment for the company and with the macro outlook?
Yeah. Well, we feel pretty good about it. This past quarter, we grew room nights 12%. Year to date, we're at 11%. We felt like that, and we said on the call, that seems like a healthy rate for us. We're going to try to do better. If you look at our opportunity, though, we just have so much opportunity to grow outside of the U.S. in places like Europe, places like Latin America. There are literally millions of properties that are out there in the world that people are staying at that aren't yet on our platform. So we think that healthy growth for us is something that we should be able to sustain for a long time to come in good economic times and bad.